Hello, everyone, and welcome back to this week's episode of the Rose and Rubini podcast, Making Sense of This World. My name is Manas Chawla, and as always, I'm joined by CEO and Head of Research, Brunello Rosa. This is a particularly important week where we're setting geopolitics again to center stage and discussing two similar but distinct geopolitical phenomena, the nuclear threats in Russia and the oil production cuts. Brunello, let's start with the nuclear threats because this is a particularly alarming reality for many people. I mean, for so much of the sort of conflict between Ukraine and Russia, we've assumed that nuclear weapons would always be out of the question. For so much of post-World War II history, we've assumed that they would never be used, that countries were too rational, that the logic of mutually assured destruction was too inevitable. And suddenly all these assumptions are being called into question. What do you think is the logic of Russia threatening to use nuclear weapons? Give me some background around that, and what sort of circumstances do you think it could be used in?
Yeah, the background was that Russia promoted referenda for the annexation of 4 provinces in Ukraine: Donetsk, Luhansk, Kherson, and Zaporizhia. And after they became part of the Russian territory, any attempt to win them back would effectively constitute an attack on the integrity of the Russian territory. Now, according to the Russian doctrine for the use of nuclear weapons, any attempt or imminent threat doesn't even need to be actual or something that is already happening. It just needs to be considered imminent threat to the continuity of the state warrants the use of the nuclear arsenal, clearly leaving lots of space for interpretation and gray areas. And clearly not everybody at the head of the Russian state has the same idea on how and when to use these nuclear weapons, but the threat that they can be used is there. Now, people are talking about tactical weapons as opposed to strategic weapons. Tactical weapons are those who are used to gain an advantage on the territory, so to speak, rather than being the strategic weapon that is used to terminate the war. At least that's the theoretical distinction. But this is also quite scary because people are now getting used to the idea, oh yes, we can use a tactical nuclear weapon as it was some sort of traditional or conventional artillery. That's not the case. It's still the beginning of a potentially nuclear exchange, as a sort of nuclear holocaust with radiations that stay there for centuries and so on and so forth. So it's as bad as it gets. Whether we will get there, it needs to be seen. Clearly, the threat has been made.
Right. It's interesting to me, we say tactical nuclear weapons have a smaller radius of action. And because there's the sense that they might be used, there's a sense that there's an element almost of wishful thinking that, maybe if they are used, it'll be, small scale and contained, and it won't be that bad somehow. But you sort of interestingly point out that Russia, makes references to Hiroshima and Nagasaki. What's sort of context of that rhetoric?
Yeah, so the idea was that the US cannot really speak about using nuclear weapons on foreign territory because they are, in fact, the only country that has done that in history. That's the rhetoric. And Hiroshima, Nagasaki being, of course, the examples that have been made, but by the very fact that there's a reference to that means that the use of these tactical nuclear weapons might, in fact, bring about an effect that is not very dissimilar from what happened in Hiroshima and Nagasaki, which was clearly not tactical at all. Also because during these last few decades, the power of the nuclear weapons has increased exponentially. So even a small one probably is able to generate an effect that is not, again, very dissimilar to what happened in Hiroshima and Nagasaki. So the correct point of view, so to speak, is that we should stop talking about any of these, even in the context of
Mm.
a brutal war, there's a limit that is probably better if it's not overtaken.
Right. Let's shift this discussion to a sort of a different sphere of the world. The oil cartel OPEC Plus decided to cut oil production by around 2 million barrels a day. I'm no oil expert, but it seems like we'd only cut production if we wanted to keep the price, closer to its sort of falling trajectory. I think it's close to $100 per barrel. What's the logic of this move?
Yeah, it seems like a logical step, if you want, from what we just discussed. But in fact, it's all the same story. The body that made the decision is OPEC Plus, and that plus stands for Russia. And clearly, the OPEC organization is trying to give a hand to Russia in this period of difficulty. And clearly, all these could not be decided without Saudi Arabia being clearly in favor of it. Saudi Arabia, that has been one of the closest allies of the US in the Middle Eastern region. So the organization came to the rescue, so to speak, of Russia, first of all, and to some extent of Saudi Arabia in terms of supporting revenues from oil sales. And again, is again a testimony of how important geopolitical considerations are becoming for determining key variables, in this case, the price of energy at the very least.
Right. It strikes me that Saudi Arabia might be pulling sort of all these levers in favor of Russia, but like you said, Saudi Arabia is also a sort of or at least we think is a kind of staunch ally of the United States in the Middle East. To put it kind of crudely, how did the US let them get away with this?
Is not that they let. I mean, is that effectively what has been proven in the last few months when Biden went to Saudi Arabia meeting with MBS, asking for, in fact, keeping oil production going in anything increase in order to reduce oil prices and act as a substitute of the Russian oil that in many countries started to be embargoed. And yet MBS said, well, thank you for your visit, Mr. President, but we are going to do what we think is best for us. So the fact is Saudi Arabia is entering a new phase of its history in which it might play, again, a very central role, but in a very different context, not just as being one of the closest allies of the US in the region, but being a global player that has energy to sell at a time in which energy is still a scarce scarce resource to be had, and is playing clearly towards the West, as is always done, but now even in the new kind of set of organizations that are emerging, this sort of BRICS plus gathering that we discussed in previous podcasts and the newsletter, in which the BRICS countries, which of course include Russia by definition, have invited Saudi Arabia and Argentina to join. So it's a new group of 7 that is kind of opposed to some extent to the old group of 7 that is centered around the US. So in this new geopolitical order, every country plays its own cards in the table where it prefers to do so.
Right. Again, goes to show how relevant geopolitics is to the current world order, not just for the sorts of things that we think it's relevant for, like war and sort of humanitarian catastrophe that is Ukraine right now, but also for driving some of the key determinants of macro financial variables, of impacting markets, of impacting civil society. As always, Brunello, thanks so much for your time and insight.
Thank you very much. Until next time.